Welcome to VSOW Another Day, Another Topic. Today we're taking a deep dive into the life and career of Maurice White, the visionary behind Earth, Wind and Fire. What's fascinating is we have two perspectives, Maurice's autobiography and a book by his bandmate, Philip Bailey.
Having these two accounts, you get a really unique look at how these two stories, these two lives intertwined and created something extraordinary.
Exactly. It's like two sides of the same coin. You get this incredible picture of Maurice White going from this shy kid in Memphis with a passion for music to becoming this powerhouse musician and band leader who really shaped the sound of an era.
And it's interesting how both Maurice and Philip had kind of tough childhoods. And those experiences really shaped them and ultimately their music.
When you say their childhoods, what do you mean? Can you give some more detail about what made their childhood so challenging? I'm curious to know if those struggles fueled your passion for music.
Well, with Maurice, his childhood was especially difficult. He actually moved to Chicago with his mother to escape his father, who he described as aspiring to be the Al Capone of Black Memphis. You can see how that kind of upbringing could drive someone to create something positive and powerful as a way to kind of distance himself from that past.
That's a fascinating insight.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder how much of his drive stemmed from those early experiences.
Mhm.
What about Philip's childhood? What challenges did he face?
Philip faced different challenges, but they were equally significant. He was raised by his mother in Denver and had serious health issues when he was young. He was premature and battled spinal meningitis and even had respiratory problems.
Wow, that's incredible. It's amazing how they both overcame so much to pursue their musical dreams. It really makes you appreciate their dedication.
Absolutely. And it's fascinating how these kind of parallel journeys, these two kids from such different worlds came together through their shared love of music. And that's really where the Earth, Wind, and Fire story starts.
Yeah. And this is where it gets interesting for me. So both Maurice and Philip were really immersed in music at a young age, but in completely different ways. Can you tell us more about those early musical influences?
Maurice was captivated by the music scene in both Memphis and Chicago. He was glued to WDIA radio and just absorbed everything from blues to gospel. It was like he was absorbing the roots of American music.
It's amazing he was exposed to such a rich musical background. It makes sense that his music would eventually become this incredible fusion of styles. What about Philip? What were his early influences?
Philip was drawn to jazz. He
Huh?
talks about laying on the floor and listening to his mom's friends, Blue Note Records collection artists like Tony Williams and Philly Joe Jones.
So we have a drummer steeped in blues and gospel, and a vocalist drawn to jazz, both of them, with this hunger to learn and grow. Did they start playing professionally right away, or did they explore other paths before committing to music?
Maurice's path was pretty direct. He started as a session drummer at Chess Records in Chicago, working with legends like Etta James and Chuck Berry.
Wow. Working with those icons must have been an amazing experience.
Mhm.
I bet he learned a lot about the business side of music, not just the music itself.
He did. And it wasn't just the music, it was leadership, too. Maurice learned to stand up for himself and his fellow musicians, even in those early days. He was already showing those skills that would make him such a great band leader later on.
So he was already showing those signs of the visionary leader he would become.
That's interesting, though, that he was a successful session musician. What pushed him to go beyond that and form his own band? Was it a creative desire or something more?
Well, he definitely had a vision. He was inspired by Motown's sophistication and wanted to create something that blended different styles and something truly unique. But there's this pivotal moment. He described a turning point. He was actually studying medicine in Chicago.
Medicine. That's a surprise. What led him to go down that path and what made him switch gears? It's unclear why he chose medical school, but it's obvious that his heart wasn't in it. He ended up meeting a mentor named Fred Humphrey, who really encouraged him to follow his true passion. Humphrey saw Maurice's potential and told him to go all in on music.
It's amazing how a chance encounter with the right person can change your whole life. But wasn't he already playing with the Ramsey Lewis Trio at that time? What made him leave such a successful group?
Well, he was doing well with them, but he needed more. He craved creative control, the freedom to pursue his own vision, which was bigger than being a drummer in a jazz group. And that led him to leave and start building Earth, Wind, and Fire.
So Maurice takes this leap of faith, heads to LA, and starts building his dream band. What about Philip? Where does his story connect with Maurice's?
Well, Philip's path was more winding. He started out in Denver playing in a band called Friends in Love, and get this, they covered Earth, Wind, and Fire songs.
That's amazing.
It is. And as fate would have it, Maurice and Verdine actually saw one of their shows while in Denver, and Philip made a strong impression, which was super important later when he moved to LA.
That's a wild coincidence. It's like destiny was pulling them together. So while Philip was honing his craft in L.A., working with the Stovall sisters and refining his vocal skills, Maurice was making a decision that would change everything. He decided to completely revamp Earth, Wind, and Fire.
And that's when the real Earth, Wind, and Fire story begins. It was a complete overhaul, a rebirth driven by Maurice's vision, what he called the concept.
A concept, that sounds intriguing. Can you unpack that a bit?
Right.
What was his vision for this new iteration of the band?
The concept was so much more than music. Maurice wanted to create a band that blended musical genres, incorporated spirituality, and created a visual spectacle. It was about pushing boundaries, both musically and culturally. He wanted to create something that transcended racial barriers, something that spoke to everyone.
That's ambitious.
Mhm.
How did Philip become a part of this new Earth, Wind, and Fire? Did he have to audition for the band like everyone else?
He did. Maurice was holding auditions, and guess who showed up?
Philip Bailey.
Exactly. And not only did he show up, but he also recommended Larry Dunn, his friend from Denver, for the keyboard position.
Talk about a game changer. It's incredible how those connections led to this iconic band.
It really is. Suddenly you have these two incredibly talented musicians, both connected to Maurice's vision, joining the band at this key moment.
So the pieces are falling into place. But was it all smooth sailing from there? Did they find success right away, or were there still obstacles?
Well, they had the talent, the vision, and the drive, but breaking into the music industry is never easy. And Maurice was still asserting his leadership, navigating the challenges of record labels and figuring things out as they went.
And this is where we start to see some friction that both Maurice and Philip talk about in their books. Was that friction purely because of the pressure of success, or was it something more fundamental about their personalities and their creative visions?
There was a power dynamic for sure. Maurice was the leader, the driving force, and that could lead to tension, especially as the band started to achieve success.
So we have this talented band with a visionary leader and a unique concept, but also facing internal challenges and the pressures of the music industry. What happens next?
Yeah.
They achieve the success they're working for.
You'll have to stay tuned to find out. We're about to dive into the rise of Earth, Wind, and Fire, the challenges, the triumphs, and ultimately their legacy.
This is just the beginning. I'm excited to see where this deep dive takes us.
Picking up where we left off, Earth, Wind, and Fire is like on the verge of something big. They've got the talent, they've got the vision and the drive, but, the music industry is tough. What's interesting here is that Maurice's book really sheds light on those early challenges, those ups and downs of dealing with record labels.
Right, and they started with Warner Bros.
Mm.
Records, right? What was that experience like for them? Did they hit any roadblocks?
They did. Their self-titled debut album came out in 1970, and it did okay, but it wasn't like the big break they'd hoped for. It seems like Warner Bros. Just wasn't the right fit.
Yeah.
Maybe they didn't quite get Maurice's vision.
Yeah, that makes sense. Every artist needs a label that really understands and supports their vision. It's funny, though, because Philip was still in Denver at that point, and his band was covering Earth, Wind, and Fire songs.
I know, isn't that incredible? He was drawn to their music even before he joined the band. It says a lot about how powerful and original their sound was even back then.
For sure. So if Warner Bros. Wasn't the right fit, how did Earth, Wind, and Fire end up at Columbia Records? What led to that change?
Their manager, Bob Cavallo, was a big believer in them. He really wanted them to meet Clive Davis, who was known for discovering talent. So they ended up doing this private showcase at Sunset Sound Studios. And just like their first audition for Bob, they totally blew everyone away.
Oh, man, I would love to be there. Can you imagine the energy in that room?
It was a game changer for them. Clive Davis saw their potential and signed them to Columbia Records, and that's when things really took off.
And their first album on Columbia was Last Days in Time. How was that album different from their earlier work? Did they have more creative freedom with Columbia?
Definitely Maurice talks about having more control at Columbia so he could really bring his vision to life. This is where the concept starts to become a reality.
I'm curious about the concept. Can you unpack that a little more? You mentioned it's not just about music. Can you give some examples of how the concept played out in their music and their performances?
It was about creating an experience for the audience. It wasn't just the music, it was the visuals, the energy, the spirituality. Their stage shows became legendary. They had elaborate costumes designed by Bill Witten, pyrotechnics, magic tricks, even a levitating pyramid. It was a spectacle, a real experience beyond just listening to music.
That's amazing. It makes sense why they were known for their live shows.
Yeah.
But what about the music itself? How did the concept shape their sound?
Maurice was all about blending genres. He took inspiration from funk, soul, jazz, rock, even classical music. He was fearless about experimenting and pushing boundaries to create something new. If you think about it, the concept was more than just entertainment. It was about breaking down barriers and creating unity through music.
That's a great point. It makes you appreciate their music on a whole other level.
Yeah.
You can hear that evolution in their first few albums with Columbia, from Last Days and Time to Head to the Sky to Open Our Eyes. They were constantly pushing the envelope, refining their sound and getting more confident.
Exactly. And then you have That's the Way of the World, their breakthrough album. This one launched them into superstardom.
That album is a classic.
Yeah.
Every song is amazing, Shining Star, the title track Reasons, Sing a Song. They became anthems. What was it about that album that made it connect with so many people?
Well, it was the music, the message, and the timing. It was catchy, the lyrics were positive, and it came out at just the right time. The world was ready for a band like Earth, Wind and Fire, a band that offered hope and joy and unity. Both Maurice and Philip talk about that time as a spiritual one, almost like they were channeling something bigger.
It's interesting that you mentioned the spiritual side because their music has such a positive, uplifting feel.
Hmm.
Did their spirituality directly influence their songwriting and the messages they put out there?
It seems that way. The concept was rooted in spirituality, in the idea that music could be transformative. They believed in positive energy and brought in things like astrology meditation and Eastern philosophy into their music and their lives.
That's fascinating. It adds another layer to their music. But even with all the success they were having, they still had challenges, right? I read about conflict within the band and how fame impacted their personal lives.
Success can be a double-edged sword. You know, both Maurice and Philip are honest in their books about the tough times they faced, right? Maurice talks about the pressure of being the leader, the need to constantly innovate, and the struggle to stay in control. He also talks about the sacrifices he made in his personal life and the relationships that were hurt because of his dedication to the band.
That must have been tough for him, balancing his passion with his life outside music.
Yeah.
What about Philip? What was he dealing with during this crazy successful period?
Well, Philip talks about his own struggles, especially with his faith and family. He discovered Christianity during a really tough time, but also had to face the temptations that came with fame and money. He also feels bad about not being there for his kids as much as he wanted to.
It reminds you that everyone has their own struggles, even those who seem to have it all.
Mm.
Their honesty makes their story so relatable. So we have this band at their peak making incredible music and pushing boundaries, but they're also dealing with conflict and personal struggles.
Yeah.
What happens next? Do things reach a breaking point or do they manage to work through it?
This is where things get really interesting. Remember, the music scene is always changing, and Earth, Wind and Fire, always ahead of their time, found themselves riding the wave of a new trend: disco.
Disco. Now that's a different direction. How did they handle this new style? Did they fully embrace the disco sound or try to hold on to their own identity?
That's what we'll get into next. We're going to explore Earth, Wind and Fire's venture into disco, the highs and lows of that era, and how their sound changed as the music industry kept evolving.
This is getting good. I can't wait to see what happens next. Okay, so we left off with Earth, Wind and Fire kind of entering the world of disco. How did they, a band known for like complex arrangements and spiritual vibes, how'd they handle a totally different genre like that?
Well, it's interesting because they didn't shy away from it at all. They were always pushing boundaries, so they just incorporated those catchy disco grooves into their sound. You know, they already had that mix of styles.
And did their fans like this new sound?
Oh, yeah. Boogie Wonderland came out in 1979, and it was a huge hit. I mean, even today, that song captures the energy of disco.
I could see that. But I bet some of their hardcore fans weren't too happy about this whole disco thing. Did Maurice ever have any issues with people calling them a disco band?
He did. You know, both in his book and in interviews, he said Earth, Wind and Fire was way more than just disco. He saw it as one element in their sound, not the whole thing. He really wanted to keep their unique identity.
And did he pull it off? Could you still hear that classic Earth, Wind and Fire sound and those disco-influenced tracks?
Oh, absolutely.
Hey.
Even with the disco beats, their albums from that time, like All in All, I Am, and Faces, they still had those core elements. The powerful vocals, the intricate arrangements, that blend of genres that made them so special.
And they kept innovating visually too, right? Their stage shows got even crazier.
Oh, yeah, totally. We're talking pyrotechnics, magic tricks,
Yeah.
a levitating pyramid. I mean, Earth, Wind and Fire was creating a whole experience for their fans. It was more than a concert. It was an event.
That's wild. It sounds like they were at the top of their game. But Philip's book mentions some tension building within the band. What was going on behind the scenes during this time of huge success?
It seems like the pressure was getting to them. Philip says he was feeling creatively stifled, frustrated by Maurice's control over the band's direction.
I get that.
Yeah.
As a creative person, you want to feel like your voice matters. Was it just creative differences, or was there something else going on?
Philip also brings up money issues. Maurice, being the leader and founder, was making most of the money. And that caused resentment, especially for those who felt like they were giving their all but not getting their fair share.
It's that classic band struggle, even when they're super successful. Did all that tension eventually lead to a breaking point?
It did. In 1984, Maurice surprised everyone by disbanding Earth, Wind and Fire.
Wow, that must have been a tough call. Why did he do it? Was it just the band drama, or were there other reasons?
Probably a mix of things. The internal conflicts, creative burnout, the music industry changing, and maybe even wanting to try new things. Both Maurice and Philip talk about that period as a time for reflection and figuring things out.
So what do they do during this break? Do they work on solo projects or just step away from music altogether?
Well, Maurice focused on his own stuff and producing for other artists. He worked with Barbra Streisand and Denise Williams, which shows he was talented beyond just Earth, Wind and Fire. And Philip started a successful solo career, even working with Phil Collins.
Interesting how they both took time to explore other things. Did they ever come back together?
They did. Earth, Wind and Fire reunited in 1987 and released a new album called Touch the World.
That's cool. Was the reunion as successful as their earlier years? Did they still have that magic?
It's hard to recapture that level of success. The music scene had changed, and their place in it wasn't the same. They had smaller crowds, and the reaction to their new music wasn't as strong.
That's got to be humbling for any artist, especially one that's been so huge. How did they handle that?
They kept going, they kept touring, recording, and even got on board with new things like MTV, even though they weren't totally into it at first.
Wait, at MTV. Why were they hesitant about MTV? You'd think they'd love that since they were so visual.
Well, Maurice thought MTV didn't give enough attention to Black artists. He saw it as kind of discriminatory.
That's a sad reminder of how things were. It says a lot about Earth, Wind and Fire, that they kept going even with those obstacles. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what do you think is the legacy of Maurice White and Earth, Wind and Fire?
Their legacy is complicated. They made innovative music that broke genre boundaries and defied categorization. They overcame racial barriers to achieve amazing success. But they also had internal struggles, personal issues, and the natural ups and downs of a long career.
It reminds you that even the biggest stars are human. They have flaws and weaknesses, but they also have incredible creativity and strength. What stands out to you as their most important contribution to music?
Their music still connects with people today. It's timeless and universal. It speaks to the power of music to uplift, inspire, and bring people together. Maurice's vision of a band that blends genres, embraces spirituality, and creates a complete experience for the audience, that vision continues to inspire.
And Philip Bailey's amazing voice, his spiritual journey, and his honesty about his struggles added a whole other dimension to the Earth, Wind and Fire story.
It's a story that reminds us how powerful music is to connect us and move us and uplift us.
That's a great way to put it. So, to everyone listening, what did you take away from this deep dive into Maurice White and Earth, Wind and Fire?
Let us know in the comments.
And don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment on the VSOW YouTube channel. Thank you for listening to VSOW, not a podcast, the YouTube channel.